By the early months of 1941, the German High Command had decided that the Rhine, Germany's great western barrier, must never be crossed. 4 years of meticulous planning followed, a fortress of steel, concrete, and explosives that was meant to be impenetrable. Every pier of the bridge was wired with 6,000 pounds of explosives placed to detonate in an instant, to fall into the river and deny any Allied advance. Bunkers were constructed along the riverbanks, reinforced with thick walls, and garrisons trained to defend the crossing at any cost. Every engineer, every soldier, every explosive charge had its purpose, all tied into a doctrine that left no room for improvisation. Hitler himself issued written orders, not once but repeatedly, commanding that no mistake could be tolerated, that every bridge commander must wait for the proper signals, and that the destruction of these crossings was to be absolute. For years, the Rhine defenses grew into a machine of precision and rigidity. Engineers calculated exact timings, the placement of charges down to the inch, and the exact sequence of detonators. Yet for all this planning, the system had a fatal flaw. It relied entirely on human obedience to orders and on assumptions about an enemy that would act like the Germans expected. Reports of potential weaknesses were filed, notes passed up the chain of command, but every suggestion had to be approved, every change sanctioned. The men on the ground were trapped in the machinery of bureaucracy, where hesitation could be fatal, but acting too quickly could break doctrine. The garrison at the Remagen bridge, a strategic crossing over the Rhine, was ready for the moment they believed would come. They had received intelligence on possible Allied movements, yet the sheer scale of the defenses seemed invincible to them. Heavy artillery was in place, anti-aircraft guns aimed at the skies, and frogmen trained to sabotage any attempts from below. Engineers ran simulations of demolitions, testing fuse timings and charge placements, all under the watchful eye of commanders who had strict instructions from Hitler himself. It was not just a bridge, it was a test of human obedience, of engineering precision, and of trust in a system that demanded perfection. Every soldier stationed there believed in their duty, yet they were unaware that perfection was impossible under the circumstances. Supplies might fail, communication could break down, and an enemy who did not follow the rules of predictable warfare could exploit any weakness instantly. For 4 years, the bridge stood as a monument to German engineering and planning, but underneath the careful calculations and rigid orders lay a quiet vulnerability, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The story of the bridge was not only about the structures built or the explosives wired, it was about people trapped within a system designed to control them, a system that valued doctrine over intuition, rules over reasoning. The men assigned to guard it would soon discover that no amount of preparation could compensate for the unpredictability of an enemy willing to think in minutes rather than hours. They had trained to act, yet the orders that governed their every move prevented them from realizing that the real test was not the crossing itself, but the ability to respond when everything went wrong. Even now, looking back, one can trace the tension, the almost palpable anticipation that filled the air around the Rhine. 4 years of preparation had created a fortress that should have been unbeatable. Soldiers knew their roles, engineers knew their calculations, commanders knew the doctrine. Yet the very thoroughness of this preparation, the meticulous attention to detail, created a trap from which there would be no escape. The story that unfolds on the day the Americans arrive is not a failure of courage or skill, but a failure of a system that could not adapt when the impossible happened. The Rhine Bridge remained in waiting, silent and foreboding. It was ready for a siege, ready for an invasion that might never come. Every cable, every detonator, every garrison soldier played their part in a grand design that promised to resist any assault. And yet, as history would show, a bridge can be perfectly prepared and still fail, not because of those who defend it, but because of the inflexibility of the system itself. This is the story of 4 years of work, of human ingenuity constrained by doctrine, and of a moment that would test everything the defenders thought they knew about war. The bridge was supposed to be unbreakable, yet the cracks had already begun to show in the months leading up to March 1945. Engineers had calculated every charge, every sequence, every explosive load down to the last detail. But when the wrong explosives arrived at Remagen, the careful equations were thrown into chaos. Friesenhahn, the German engineer responsible, had planned for a type of explosive that would tear the piers apart efficiently. But the materials he actually received were weaker, slower, and far less reliable. The precision he had worked toward for years suddenly became meaningless. The system that had been trusted for 4 years could not accommodate a single deviation. Every pier was wired, every detonator placed, yet no one could predict the failures that would arise from a chain of small errors. Communication lines were fragile, radios were often missing or malfunctioning. Orders from high command, based on doctrine rather than reality, required multiple confirmations before any action could be taken. The men on the ground knew that their task was absolute destruction if the Americans arrived, yet they also knew that waiting for the correct signal could cost them the one chance to act. The bridge had become a trap, and those who manned it were prisoners of both their equipment and their orders. Friesenhahn and his team moved through the bridge like surgeons with a complicated procedure, placing each charge carefully. The weight of responsibility rested on their shoulders. Every calculation had been double-checked, every fuse inspected. Yet the reality of war is rarely as clean as theory. The wrong explosive in the wrong location was a problem the men could not solve in time. Even as they worked, the men realized that the system itself might betray them. They were bound by orders they could not override, constrained by doctrine that left no room for improvisation. Their enemy would not wait for confirmations, would not hesitate for protocol. The garrison felt the pressure of months of preparation, yet it was impossible to prepare for the speed and decisiveness of the American advance. The bridge, which had been designed to fall in a controlled explosion, was vulnerable not because of lack of effort or courage, but because the tools at their disposal were imperfect and the rules governing their actions were rigid. Engineers calculated, officers hesitated, and soldiers waited, all while the clock ticked toward an enemy that would not play by their rules. Even small mistakes compounded quickly. A misfired detonator, a damaged wire, a delay in a radio message could turn hours of preparation into a moment of disaster. Friesenhahn understood the math, the physics, and the sequence of destruction, but he could not change the fact that the materials supplied to him were insufficient. It was a failure born not of incompetence, but of circumstance, miscommunication, and the unyielding nature of doctrine. This was the true danger of a system built to perfection. It cannot adapt when reality deviates. The men who stood watch along the Rhine felt both confidence and dread. Confidence in their calculations, in their training, in the heavy defenses around them. Dread because they sensed that no plan survives first contact with the enemy perfectly intact. Orders demanded absolute obedience, yet obedience in the face of imperfection could be deadly. They were trained to execute a sequence that assumed everything would function flawlessly. They were not trained to survive when the sequence failed. When March 7th arrived, all the planning, all the calculations, all the years of preparation came up against a reality that was impossible to anticipate fully. The bridge was not a failure because the men were unprepared, but because the system itself could not account for the variables of war. A single missing radio, a delayed message, and the wrong explosives in the wrong hands meant that even the most carefully engineered defenses were vulnerable. The men who had devoted years to safeguarding the Rhine were caught between the orders they could not break and the enemy that would not wait. This chapter is not about courage or cowardice, skill or ineptitude. It is about the fragile gap between theory and reality,
between calculation and execution, and the human cost when systems fail. The Remagen Bridge, wired and ready, stood as a monument to meticulous preparation, yet it was also a monument to the limits of planning. The explosives, the detonators, the garrison, all were in place, yet a simple mismatch, a delay, a deviation threatened to unravel everything. The bridge was a fortress, but the fortress was only as strong as the system that governed it, and that system was about to be tested in ways no one could have predicted.
March 7, 1945 began like any other day along the Rhine, yet for the men at the bridge, it would become a moment that history would remember forever. Across the river, American forces were moving with a speed and decisiveness the Germans had never anticipated. Unlike their enemy, who had spent years building perfection into steel and concrete, the Americans relied on improvisation, audacity, and timing measured in minutes, not hours. Every hesitation on the German side would soon be exploited, every delay magnified by the relentless rhythm of the attack. The first American troops arrived with an intensity that caught the defenders off guard. Engineers had wired the bridge to explode, yet the timing was crucial. The garrison waited for the correct signals, for confirmation from higher command, for orders that were shackled by doctrine. The Americans did not wait. Small teams of soldiers scrambled across the bridge, calculating every step as they advanced. They ignored traditional risks, adapting instantly to the obstacles in front of them. Bridges and rivers could be defended for months, but in the hands of those who think in minutes, even the strongest defenses could crumble. Within 11 minutes, the impossible happened. The Americans had crossed, using bold maneuvers and rapid decisions that the German command could not comprehend. 3 levels of command, each supposed to coordinate the defense and execute a demolition, failed to act in time. The soldiers on the bridge were following orders, yet the orders themselves were paralyzing. The right explosives were not detonated, the fuses failed, and communication lines had broken down. The speed of the attack exposed the vulnerabilities hidden beneath years of preparation. The American officers, aware of the stakes, pressed forward with calculated disregard for procedure. Every obstacle was a challenge, not a reason to halt. Engineers disarmed or bypassed charges, soldiers navigated rubble and fire, and commanders adjusted plans in real time. It was not luck, nor was it carelessness. It was an understanding that rigid doctrine could never match the fluidity of a well-timed assault. The Germans had created a machine of precision, yet a human opponent with initiative could outpace it in minutes. High above, observers watched the chaos unfold. Artillery had been positioned, V-2 rockets fired, Luftwaffe sorties scrambled, and frogmen sent to sabotage the crossing, but coordination failed. Each attack on the Americans was isolated, disconnected, and delayed. The bridge, which should have been the anchor of a defense that stretched across the Rhine, became a symbol of failure, not of courage, but of the system itself. The Americans did not need overwhelming force. They needed speed, ingenuity, and the willingness to break rules the Germans were shackled to. At 11:15 a.m., one German officer arrived at the bridge with no troops, no radio, and no ability to influence the situation. He was too late to save the defenses, too late to stop the crossing, and yet he bore the consequences. Days later, he would be executed, a victim not of his own incompetence, but of a system that punished those it should have empowered. The Americans moved across the bridge almost laughing at the speed at which they could render months of planning useless. The crossing became a matter of minutes, each tick of the clock exposing the fragility of a system built for perfection. The chaos on the bridge was a mirror of the battlefield itself, doctrine and preparation against initiative and improvisation. Soldiers who had spent years waiting for the correct orders could only watch as their enemy calculated in moments what had taken them years to prepare. The explosives, the bunkers, the backup plans all failed to matter when the American forces applied relentless pressure. By the time the smoke cleared, the bridge remained standing, yet under enemy control, a monument to both German engineering and German miscalculation. The story of the crossing is not one of chance, but of a lesson in speed and adaptability. The Americans did not destroy the bridge perfectly. They did not need to. They had bypassed the system that was supposed to make failure impossible. 11 minutes had undone 4 years of preparation, exposing the limits of doctrine and the human cost of rigidity. The crossing was a moment when initiative overwhelmed instruction, when thinking in minutes defeated planning in years, and when a bridge became both a prize and a warning for those who would underestimate the power of decisiveness.
The aftermath of the crossing revealed the human cost hidden behind the numbers and calculations. On the German side, the system that had demanded perfection now demanded punishment. Men who had acted or failed to act under impossible conditions were judged not by their courage or skill, but by their adherence to rigid orders. The officer who arrived at the bridge at 11:15 a.m. with no troops and no way to change the course of events became a symbol of this cruelty. He was executed 7 days later, a victim not of the Americans, but of the very system he had served. The men who had been stationed along the Rhine faced the same fate in courts-martial, their lives discarded to reinforce doctrine. The trials were swift, the judgments harsh. It was a form of justice that required a scapegoat, a tangible figure upon whom the failure could be pinned. Yet the truth was that the failure was systemic, embedded in years of inflexible orders, delayed communications, and faulty materials. The men on the ground had never been given the tools or the freedom to succeed. The system had set them up to fail from the start. Yet the chain of command demanded accountability, and human lives were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of control. The bridge itself, now under American control, stood as a silent witness to the executions and the impossible choices. Soldiers who had wired explosives, who had waited for orders, who had done everything expected of them, were now absent, replaced by a grim certainty that the system valued doctrine above life. Their stories are often lost in the larger narrative of the war, overshadowed by strategy and statistics. Yet each man represents a lesson in the dangers of obedience without adaptability, of rigid rules applied in chaotic circumstances. Families of the executed officers and soldiers faced their own horror, receiving word of deaths that made little sense and offered no closure. Orders had been issued to prevent mistakes, yet the very attempt to prevent failure had led to its most tragic form. Lives ended not by the enemy, but by a mechanism designed to enforce perfection. The German military's attempt to create an unbreakable chain of command revealed the fragility of human judgment when constrained by fear and regulation. Even those who survived the immediate crossing were haunted by what they had witnessed. The Americans had taken the bridge, yes, but the true cost to the defenders was psychological and moral. They had been trained to follow instructions, to act within doctrine, and yet the rules that had guided them had proven fatal. It was a paradox. The better they obeyed, the less likely they were to survive. The executions were the final, cruel punctuation to 4 years of preparation and months of tension, a reminder that in war, the system can be as deadly as the enemy's bullets. Historians later examined the court-martials, the orders, and the chain of events with a mixture of fascination and horror. They found that the officers had no realistic chance to prevent the crossing, that delays and miscommunications had sabotaged every plan, and that the choice to execute was entirely preventable. The lesson is not one of heroism or villainy, but of structural failure, of a machine of war that devoured its own parts in pursuit of perfection. The human element, judgment, intuition, adaptation, had been sacrificed at the altar of doctrine. The shadow of the Remagen bridge was heavy with silence after the chaos, yet it whispered the lessons of a system that failed its people. Every bunker, Every charge, every garrison soldier had been part of a plan that was flawless on paper, but impossible in practice. The men who lived and the men who died were proof that even the most meticulous planning cannot replace human judgment in moments of crisis. Their stories resonate as a warning when obedience outweighs initiative, when doctrine becomes inflexible. History can be cruel, and the cost of perfection is often measured in human lives. In the shadow of the Remagen Bridge, the events of those days cast a long and haunting lesson. Systems can be precise, orders can be clear, and preparations can be exhaustive, yet the moment of crisis always exposes human vulnerability. The officers executed, the soldiers paralyzed, the engineers frustrated, all serve as a reminder that in war, rigid adherence to rules can be more dangerous than the enemy's bullets. The crossing had succeeded not just because of speed or audacity, but because it exploited the weaknesses built into the German system itself. This chapter is a testament to the human cost of inflexibility, a stark portrait of obedience turned deadly. The bridge, standing under American control, is more than a military objective. It is a monument to the men who were condemned for following impossible orders. Their stories, their executions, and their silent suffering reveal the tragic consequences when doctrine triumphs over judgment, when the system punishes those it was designed to protect, and when history measures success in control rather than humanity.
The Remagen Bridge, captured in 11 minutes, became a symbol not of a fleeting victory, but of the strategic consequences that rippled across the final months of the war. For the Americans, it was more than a crossing. It was a door into the heart of Germany, a foothold that allowed forces to advance more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. Eisenhower would later measure the cost of the crossing not in lives or artillery, but in months of German planning that had been rendered meaningless by a single audacious maneuver. What took years to prepare had fallen in minutes, and the consequences would echo long after the smoke cleared. The Germans had relied on doctrine, on calculation, and on the expectation that their enemy would act predictably. They had stockpiled explosives, wired every pier, positioned artillery and air units, and yet all of it had failed to stop the Americans. The bridge was supposed to fall, yet it remained intact in the hands of the enemy. For 4 years, every engineer, every soldier, every commander had trusted in a system designed to prevent failure. But a system that cannot adapt is vulnerable, and the Americans exploited that vulnerability with decisive speed. As American troops poured across, the psychological impact on both sides was immense. German commanders realized too late that their perfect plans had been undone, and their soldiers, already fatigued and uncertain, faced the crushing reality of defeat. Meanwhile, the Americans pressed forward, improvising in real time, adjusting to obstacles, and calculating each move with the understanding that hesitation was lethal. The crossing became an object lesson in initiative versus doctrine, in thinking ahead in minutes rather than months. It was not brute force alone, but speed, adaptability, and courage that had turned the tide. Eisenhower himself noted that the capture of the bridge accelerated the Allied advance, allowing troops to move into Germany faster than anticipated. What might have taken months of careful planning was now compressed into weeks. For the Germans, the bridge represented lost time, lost opportunities, and the limits of a system that punished its own men. Every day that the Americans held the bridge was a day that Germany could not recover, a day that hastened the collapse of defensive lines and the eventual surrender. The story of the bridge is also a story of human ingenuity and decisive action. Soldiers who crossed under fire had to calculate, improvise, and act with courage, often ignoring conventional rules of engagement to achieve their objectives. Engineers disabled explosives, officers took calculated risks, and troops faced relentless obstacles without hesitation.
In that moment, the combination of speed, daring, and flexibility became more powerful than years of rigid preparation. The bridge itself was secondary to the human capacity to act decisively under pressure. Yet, even as the Americans celebrated, the human toll remained evident. The Germans lost lives, morale, and trust in their system, while the defenders faced punishment for failures they could not control. The bridge had been defended by people caught between orders they could not break and the overwhelming initiative of an enemy that did not wait. Their sacrifice, often overlooked in the broader narrative of the war, reminds us that victory and loss are measured not only in territory or time, but in the lives and choices of individuals forced to act within flawed systems. By the end of the day, the Remagen Bridge stood as a paradox. It was intact, yet defeated. It was a fortress, yet a passageway. It had been prepared with the utmost care, yet it had failed. And in that failure lies the lesson of history. Meticulous planning cannot always withstand speed and audacity, and rigid systems often crumble when challenged by human initiative. The bridge was a crossing, a symbol, and a warning, all at once. The Americans had achieved more than a military objective. They had exposed the limits of German command, the flaws in doctrine, and the vulnerabilities of human systems under stress. The Rhine, long thought to be impassable, had been breached not through sheer firepower, but through decisiveness, improvisation, and the willingness to act when the rules demanded hesitation. Months of careful planning were undone in moments, and history was changed forever. As the dust settled, the Remagen Bridge stood as a testament to both the brilliance and the failure of human endeavor. 4 years of preparation, thousands of man-hours, and mountains of explosives had been rendered almost irrelevant by a combination of speed, courage, and ingenuity. For the men on the bridge, for the officers executed, and for the soldiers who pressed forward, the events of that day remain a vivid reminder of what can happen when systems fail and individuals act decisively. The crossing of the Remagen Bridge is a story of contrasts: doctrine versus initiative, preparation versus improvisation, rigidity versus flexibility, and ultimately of human lives caught in the balance. It is a story that continues to resonate, a bridge that symbolizes not only military strategy, but the profound consequences of timing, courage, and the human capacity to act when the world seems impossible to navigate. Even decades later, historians and military strategists study the crossing to understand the fragile balance between planning and action. Every minute of that day became a lesson in human decision-making under pressure, a reminder that no matter how perfect a system seems, it can be undone by adaptability, speed, and the unpredictability of war. The Bridge of Remagen was more than steel and concrete. It was a stage for human courage, error, and the relentless march of history.